to have timestamps.
Oh, yeah, please. And yeah, don't type in the chat, please. Thank you. History is long and stretches infinitely back into the past. That means that the suffering and pain that various oppressed minorities have experienced are also innumerable and hugely undercover in the status quo. The very incentives that OG says the people in power have to cover up this painful past and gaslight the fact that people now blame the people in power for the suffering that they endure is the very reason why it's so very important for members of minorities now to reclaim that by putting the focus back on the past. First on OG, as quickly as possible, and then explaining why our material ought to win the round. So DPM can't slide around our case by saying, the Hunger Games is not representative of our case because it's a piece of historical fiction, apparently, because it draws on historically concepts like segregation. I want to be very, very clear. This debate is not about they defend a purely hypothetical ideal world, and we defend literally any piece of fiction that draws on events that have happened in the past. By that logic, their own example of 1984 is a piece of historical fiction. It's in 1984 for one, but also it covers concepts such as surveillance, the restriction of personal identity, the use of language as a way to control people's behavior. All of this already exists. But even in the best case scenario that this is the world that they're trying to defend, it's also like the reason why they should lose, because a world where it's purely hypothetical and doesn't draw on existing concepts is almost entirely devoid of value, except for purely aesthetic value in terms of the artist's own satisfaction. It's not even, cathartic or some kind of reclaiming control, very simply because that just means that, there's nothing to reclaim on. Can you please not send POI in the chat? Okay. So second of all, I just also want to say that, their response was that, the Hunger Games aren't, even if the Hunger Games is an example, it's not everything. You may wonder, why am I picking on this example so much? Because I genuinely think that it's like a good microcosm for where their case falls. Because our analysis and our use of the Hunger Games is a demonstration of the kinds of fiction that become more prominent at the point at which you believe that the most valuable art is art set in the future. The reason why works such as The Hunger Games and Divergent are the first two dystopian novels and movies that come to your mind and were the most sailed ones are because they're white, the actors that play them were attractive, because it's a fantastical and exaggerated world wherein there's a huge amount of escapism, but also crucially because it's designed to have reactions from the public and there's a happy ending. That's really, really dangerous, actually. More people consume it because it's more pleasurable and there's more hype, but it's also bad because it creates a future where the arc of justice bends towards correction, which is also just not true. Yes, the past restricts the stories that can be told because, there are there are facts, but that's great because that's a check, right? It forces people to be ominous and cynical because the past is very, very bloody and the past is very, very brutal and does capture realistic pain. So 3 things from OG. The first is on value of creation. I think Lucia already gave a response to this. I'll add another because I really like this argument. Yes, creation is super valuable. The thing is though, creation always exists along a spectrum because yes, I'm creating a world when I'm imagining a totally new one for myself in the future, but I'm also creating a world when I'm imagining what my ancestors lived through 200 years ago and trying to put my mind into myself into the shoes of someone in those positions. But also, I would posit that there are also so many different factors that define like creation. How long is your book probably defines creation, but also just I think that the most important factor in terms of artistic satisfaction is just purely subjective. And I would posit that the artist that chooses to exercise their artistic license and beauty through the exercising of the historical past probably suggests that they derive more utility and creative happiness from imagining that world. So I think more power to them. Second thing then on historical events and how they're a bad medium, because oftentimes they're very restrictive. Again, I like this argument. But the first thing I would say is that authors operate on doubtful past all the time. The reason for this is because they try very, very hard. The artists are the most likely to to write these pieces are acutely aware of the fact that oftentimes historical narratives are determined and controlled by the people in power, often who are very white and pretty male. The thing is then that they're acutely aware of the fact that the proof of this is that they're writing about a piece of oppression, which according to OG's analysis was covered up by previous people. But second of all, like even in the worst case scenario where they fail, it's fiction. You can have some inaccuracies. Yes, people might call you out, but because inaccuracies exist on a question of scale, they're way more likely to call out problematic narratives than minor historical details in your fiction. But finally, I also just think that yes, the monopoly on information exists. That's why it's so important to increase the quality of fiction out there and provide alternate sources and perspectives on historical trauma. Before I go to the third point by OG, I'll take CG.
Nothing in the motion says that the fiction is written by marginalized people. What's to stop a bunch of white people from writing historical fiction where the civil rights movement fixes racism and it doesn't exist anymore?
I mean, they can, but how many books do you know like that? Very, very few. Just because if you want to read about historical trauma, you're going to pick something that person from that community has written. Because if a white person writes that kind of fiction, they're going to get called out. But also because the people who are the most interested in reading about these fictions are people who are trying to correct for gaps in their knowledge or see their people represented, and therefore they have that self-selection mechanism as well. Finally, on weaponizing narratives, I would say that you have some degree of ownership over historical trauma if your current quality of life is affected by it. But finally, I would say that what is violence? Violence isn't about recounting anything that's painful. It's about whether or not actually causes pain. For example, I can mention sexual assault in the context of someone who I knew who've experienced this, but if my intent is supportive, that's not a violent act. On the other hand, if I'm mentioning it to hurt them, obviously it's violent. For those reasons, I think OG completely falls. Then let me just recount what Lucia told you and explain why it's the most important issue in the round. So first, on representation. Lucia told you about profit incentives, about how, oftentimes historical fiction is a niche, whereas dystopias means that works by marginalized communities are often much, much less visible within the category of dystopias. But there are also structural reasons why it's often impossible to represent the views of marginal communities in dystopias. Because when you create an entire world, you do not pay attention to the minutiae of one individual community. You have to create an entire world. As in counterfactual, the framework of the world already exists, and you're going into detail about how people within it suffered. Why is this so important? Because one, it's people from the community feel heard and feel like their pain is represented and listened to. It is important to them feeling their pain is valid, knowing it happened, and that other people experienced it, and therefore that they're not just whiny or like hysterical for thinking certain things. Governments will always have the standard story, as OG says, which is what's so very valuable. We have alternative stories from oppressed groups. If someone's real life is in the story, real people went through this, that has immense value. And that's a panel believes that as soon as we die, the things that we went through have no more value, even to our descendants. I think that's the single most important value in the round, because you need to know who you are, you need to know your place in history, and historical suffering cannot be erased. Very happy to oppose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech, and apologies for that first timestamp. It is wild how much that's got on autocorrect, not autocorrect, but like it's automated essentially. You know what I mean? English is hard. And after a excellent top half, we invite the member of Gov.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, I just want to say that I am doing this final against like a lot of different people I'm friends with, and this has been a very fun tournament, and this is itself a very fun debate, and I'm just very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So there's been not very much of a clear idea in this debate about how art actually affects the world. OG is just like, art has no effect on the world, and OO is completely vague. They say almost nothing at all about this and have very little framing about what impact they're actually trying to achieve. So I want to start by clarifying what we think art actually does for people, because we agree with like a lot of what OG said and what I assume Hadar was implying in her POI, which is that yes, art is not going to be the absolute primary thing that decides what your political beliefs are. In particular, when you are making conscious decisions about what political movements to support, those are things that are likely to be highly rationally considered. And like most people are just not going to pull from art as the primary thing to do that, because then they will like feel silly because they are pulling from a work of fiction, and that's just not how most people think. However, here's where I think art does have impact, and this is the kind of impacts that other teams needed to be hitting in the round. The way that art impacts people's mentalities is that you develop your schema through art, especially for abstract things, which are hard to learn unless you are made to relate to them. What do I mean by this? This changes how we read the news or what articles we choose to read in the first place because of the subconscious associations that it makes. Specifically, art can help inform our ideas of what is important in the world. For example, are we primed to think about the possibility of a global catastrophe? Are we primed to think that our democracy could turn into a dictatorship? This is the kind of thing that art does. It changes the way that we subconsciously approach the world, and it introduces these ideas into our consciousness such that we begin to notice them in other places. So what we need to be doing in this debate is to figure out what kinds of schemas people need to be good political actors in the world and to be the kind of people who are on the side of justice rather than injustice in their political decisions. It isn't going to be like the definitive thing for what decisions they consciously make, but it does decide what feels important to people and what kinds of information people are likely to seek out, which does have an impact on this. So OO talks a lot about amplifying the voices of minorities, but it's not connected to any particular impact for these minorities. We'll engage with this material, but I just want to highlight that OO is probably being beaten by OG because OG at least gets value for those creators, whereas I'm really not sure what OO is even trying to do in this debate. But also, if minorities want to amplify their voices, it seems like the best way to do this is neither past nor future stories, but just stories about the present day, and those exist on either side of the house. So yeah, OO seems to miss what's important in the debate. We beat OG because one, OG only talks about art made by marginalized people, but not all art about injustices is actually made by marginalized people. So we're going to win on more art by talking about its effect on the reader, regardless of who writes it. And two, we like the weighing that OG expected. Like, yes, we do get concrete change, which is probably more impactful for people connecting to their identities and being able to express themselves because it's easier to express yourself in a world that doesn't hate you. So what kinds of schema do people need to have with regards to injustice? I think it takes the form of three things, and these are the 3 points I'm going to cover in this debate. Firstly, they need to know that injustice exists and can exist in their world. Secondly, they need to know what that injustice looks like. And thirdly, they need to know what can be done about that injustice. This is what I'm going to cover in my speech. I'm going to talk about how art about the future is better at creating schemas for these things than art about the past. Firstly, what is better at showing that injustice exists in the world? So I think that ops narratives are likely to be happy arcs, not always, but often, where justice is overcome, suggesting that problems no longer exist today. OO challenges me to name art that looks like this. I think it's probably movies like Selma or The Help, and I think it's just very intuitive, and the average reasonable voter would know that this is widely believed by white moderates in America, that like the civil rights movement fixed racism and it doesn't exist anymore. It's weird for XK to suggest that no one thinks that. So I'm going to give you the structural incentives that authors of historical fiction have to give these kinds of hopeful arcs and why they are unlikely to give arcs that are like why they are likely to give arcs that suggest there are no problems currently. There are 2 reasons for this. One, people generally don't like being sad. I think it's a total assertion from OO that people don't read history for escapism. Plenty of people read history to fantasize about a time period that they perceive as being better, and people don't like being sad, so they don't want hopeless arcs. 2, if you suggest that oppression from the past is still ongoing, it often implicates present-day structures like the American government or corporations that still exist, meaning that no one wants to publish you because it's too controversial. In response to this, XK says that people writing about injustice want to portray it accurately, and maybe so, but that's what white people think they're doing when they say that racism is over. And they say that people reading about injustice want to fill the gaps in their knowledge. Total assertion. Plenty of people just want entertainment. If they wanted to fill the gaps in their knowledge, they would probably read nonfiction. So can you suggest then, so like I've shown you why Ops World cannot create the correct schemas with regards to injustice existing. Can Gov's World do it? So I think yes, for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's a lesser incentive for hopeful stories because it doesn't implicate anyone, so you can have things like 1984. And secondly, even if you do have a hopeful story, that's fine because it doesn't suggest that oppression is over. You can have a hopeful story about overcoming oppression while still giving people schemas for the kinds of oppression that exists in the present day. And once you've put those ideas in people's heads, even if you don't directly say, oh, this is what the real world looks like, once you've given people an idea of what injustice looks like, they notice it in the world around them. I'm really sorry, XK, I didn't manage my time well and I don't have time to take your POI. Okay, second thing to talk about, what form does oppression take? So the biggest problems that we are facing today are often just not present in the past. What does this look like? This looks like climate change, which requires a profoundly new relationship with technology, as many of the solutions may be things like geoengineering. It requires refugee and migration flows that we have never seen before in human history. There's just no way that historical fiction can give you the kind of conceptions of the present day that are actually helpful in solving this problem, but dystopias can. Another example is AI, which profoundly changes the nature of privacy. It profoundly changes the nature of our identities because computers computers know more about us than we know about ourselves. We do need to be attentive to those things. We need to pay attention to the way that AI allows corporations and governments to control us and oppress us. But you can't get that from the past because these things just didn't exist in the past. Third thing to say, the ways that things can be changed. I think that social media has profoundly changed how social movements worked. In the past, because it was so hard to organize people en masse and to get everyone thinking the same thing, revolutions were generally vanguards. We see this in like the Soviet Revolution or like the Cuban Revolution, where a small group of people helped the masses. But in the era of social media, that's just not what change looks like anymore. Change comes from the masses. But their fiction is going to be giving people the idea that what they should be looking for is a strong leader or a small movement of leaders that can bring change to the masses. This is not ideal because this is not a very democratic way of creating change, and often, like as we saw in the Soviet Union, creates change that isn't actually good for the marginalized people of the world because they don't have a voice in how that change happens. We would rather people expect we would rather people expect that the way change happens is through a movement of mass people that actually have control over how that change is happening. That's the kind of schema that they need in order to be effective political actors in the world. Very proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech and recommend they get water after that one. And now invite member of OP to extend the case of side up.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Quick caveat, I'm speaking from shelter. There might be Wi-Fi connection issues. If at any point I get disconnected, just let me know. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. For many years, Superman movies have been out, and I have not once seen any kid with underwears over their tights trying to jump off a roof and fly. The problem with most art debates and what everyone concedes as different points is that most art, not all, but most art, doesn't have a direct impact on people because people don't do what they see on TV. People don't act like what happens in books because they know that it's fiction. We posit that what does change minds is, sorry for quoting Ben Shapiro, facts and logic, which sadly is actually a real thing that people buy into today, right? Or not sadly, according to some views, I don't know. What we are going to prove is that people get exposed to facts and logic more when there are stories about actual occasions in their life or that have occurred in their country that they can later on be motivated to read more about or learn more about in their history lessons. That the connection to the real life news and research that happens out there that actually does change minds happens uniquely on our side. Before that, few pieces of excellence rebuttal to CG. On the idea of white writers are going to depict historical injustices wrong because they perceive it wrong, etc. Several responses. One, our case is not contingent at any point. Even if I'm going to completely concede that the narrative itself, that reading the book is going to pass along the wrong message, I don't care, because I'm going to prove that the message you get in the book isn't going to change your action, but rather the things you read about after you finish the book, and that is going to be based on facts. Secondly, I don't think that they've actually proven that the likely case is actual representation based on white interpretations, right? I do think, and that's touched it already, right? That people do tend to write about things that they care about and are passionate about, and that especially given that today there's also a PC audience that is going to criticize you for it, and note, unlike fiction, you're able to actively hold authors accountable if they lie about the facts. Lastly, the fact that most of these cases symmetric to their side as well, because is Orwell not flipped for both sides? Like, do Republicans not say that PC culture is Orwellian because you cannot say what you think? Like, I mean, come on. Every piece of art can be interpreted by white people to be bad thing. This is not a case that is unique to their side or is proven to be unique to their side. Lastly, and the idea that there are new problems like climate change. I'm not sure climate change is in the debate because I'm not sure if it's considered an injustice. And insofar as we are talking about new injustices, such as oppressing a new minority that we didn't oppress before, or whatever, I think it can be easily analogized to already existing oppressions and injustices. But secondly, like, as OG framed this debate, we are not talking about preferring a world where you only have this type of art or that type of art. Presumably extreme cases that literally cannot have our side of the debate, that you can literally not depict based on history, they can have on their side. We are debating the likely scenario on which do we support more, given that we don't defend the world with just one alternative. Cool. Let's talk about art versus facts. Why do we think overwhelmingly people don't change their actions, voting patterns, or activism based on just art? because they know that it is propaganda. Art has this idea that you know that the author has a message they want to send. The producer is, I don't know, a liberal or whatever other stereotype you have over them. You are much less likely to be susceptible to this message because it is perceived to be completely subjective when they control the whole story. There is more veil of objectivity to news, especially when you are able to consume it from different sources, to just objective facts that you cannot contradict, etc. Secondly, we are to generally just have a mindset of that is not believing what we see on TV, right? Like parents tell you from a very young age, don't believe everything you see on TV. We are used to it from Photoshop and knowing that they have massive budgets to do many things that are not accurate of real life, right? So the mindset we enter with is not a mindset about educating ourselves, but rather a mindset of having fun. Thirdly, the fact that we just don't care enough to act about these things, right? When something feels like fiction and not directly connected to our life, we don't care enough in order to actually act upon it. Whereas when we read about something that has an actual relevance, like me being in the fucking middle of a war zone right now, I'm much more likely to actually go and do something about it because I'm actually actively impacted. Why does it happen uniquely under our side? Several reasons. A, what Gwen mentioned about me being able to have daily connotations in my mind happens uniquely on our side. Because when I read that book that is based on, I don't know, whether it is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in my context or the wave in history lessons about the Holocaust or whatever, that is the point where I actually get constant reminders in the day-to-day because it reminds me of things that really happened, that are talked about in my history lesson or my news. I am much less likely to think of Orwell when I see those stuff because it's not from their book. I don't have this reference point as much. Secondly, it's much easier for my teachers to integrate it in history lessons, as often done with the wave, right? It is much easier when you can show it as A, something that is based on the actual content being learned rather than fiction, but B, when you're much less afraid of being seen like you're pushing your own agenda because, you know, teachers don't want to be the kind that are later blamed by the parents of pushing an agenda, and you can interpret Orwell in this way or another, but it's very hard to interpret like To Kill a Mockingbird in more than one way, right? So it's much easier for them to bring it as an educational content. Thirdly, the fact that I am much more likely to just search things afterwards in the news because when I am reading about it and it's interesting to me, I have something to read about later. I know, this is based on a real event. I want to hear more about this. I cannot do this with something that I don't have more to read about other than just fun fiction because I don't have anything to take interest in other than that. Before I move on, opening, go.
Yeah, so the problem is that I do not understand why the main claim is that minorities are being screwed over. That's just a response to OO. The case is that future hypotheticals unreliant on hijacking lived experiences and reduces the current
Awesome. You had plenty of time to respond to OO. Cool. Moving on next. Fourthly, the fact that it is easier to point inaccuracies also creates a discussion that links it back to the real life, right? Because if indeed a white author is going to write a very biased book about the slavery, it means that you're going to hear probably African-American people criticizing it. And in the criticism, they're going to bring facts from real life, like look at the police brutality rates that still exist till this day. And then you're going to be exposed to facts much more often. You cannot do this to Orwell, say, look, he was inaccurate, he was lying factually about stuff, and bring about this discussion about real life facts because there's no grounds to compare to and show that it is inaccurate, right? So this discourse is also going to happen much more on our side. Lastly, the fact that it is just something that sounds more believable to actually happen. When I read about a dystopia, I'm not afraid so much about this happening to me or to my country because I know it is a dystopia. I know that it is something that comes out of fiction and it is easy for me to say, nah, it's not going to happen to me. When I read about something that actually happened, when I read about the wave and I think no one would ever do that, but then I realize, oh, but they did, it makes it much more likely for me to fear that it might happen in my own country against a different minority this time and make me more aware and reading about this because I know it's based on a real story.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech and invite the Gov Whip to conclude the case for said government.
Can you hear me well?
Yep.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. Opening government talks primarily about access to agency and shaping the kind of narratives that you create, which is greater than when in the past for your position and information is control. And secondly, about a principle that it is wrong to instrumentalize actors in the past, and therefore creates a moral risk when you write about the past that you wind up doing that in order to get like your particular suited narrative out there. There are three weighings that I have against this. The first is that I think the difference in agency is actually negligible, i.e. I believe that it exists, but there is a crucial problem because the information, the inspiration that you have to process and turn into art is still something that is mediated by the world in which you live, at which point, even though the canvas on which you paint is freer, the painter and the paints that you have is not, at which point that difference is small. Secondly, Gwen meaningfully broadens the scope of context to which this debate applies, i.e. not just to actors who have no access to material from the past, but rather also to those who do and who simply have various incentives to interpret it in manners that are problematic. Thirdly, on the principle, I think it is more important to give now and current and future people the tools to relate to injustices affecting them because they have greater capacity to feel and experience impacts than people of the past. Specifically, like PM tries to burn ground, but look at the BP rule book, you can't burn ground without actually running the material on it, right? You can't just claim everything else is unimportant and then expect all of us to buy that. In order to do that, you would have to actually run the material. They don't. The thing is that when explained specifically why for some, art is specifically uniquely the thing that allows you to create effective schema in order to understand the world and why that is incredibly useful. I think art has an obligation to allow people to learn from those and to apply that to injustices that currently affect them. Because at the point where you do learn from them, you choose what news you read, you choose what news you prioritize because you see more potential allusions into the future, because that means that you do care more about it. It means you make the time trade-off to go to a protest about something, the point where you've been given a bit of information on the basis of having read an article that your country is going to be doing something bad with regard to climate change. Now, at the point where you have the tool to conceptualize that more effectively, you actually do something. I think that is an obligation to give to people. OG cannot burn ground without actually running any case on it. As a result of that, I think that principal obligation is greater, therefore, on principle, we're beating open government. Let's talk about closing opposition. First, on rebuttal, you think more about what you read when it is real. I think there's a couple of issues with that. The first one is that there's a symmetrical issue with that, which is that at the point where you expect it to be describing things that you yourself experience or that are real to your life, the moment that it deviates from that to any degree, you perceive the entire thing as being undermined, and therefore you are likely to consider any messaging within it that is supposed to communicate the experience of someone else to you as being a lie or as being biased or distorted. I think that means you're arguably less likely to effectively engage with the material at the point where it no longer conforms to either what you expected from it, if you're a white reader trying to appease your own conceptualization of what the civil rights movement was, or if it doesn't reflect your exact experience because minorities are internally diverse. Secondly, with regard to history teaching, I'm just going to reality check this. I think most people hate literature they're assigned in school, and I don't think they care about it particularly. I think most people learn more from stuff that they read outside of that, which means that is more important. On research, I think lots of newspaper articles do use metaphors and reference and terminology that also comes out of books because they know that it relates to people and they appeal to people who utilize those kinds of schema. I think that becomes more effective and you can parse that more effectively into your own experience when you understand what it is talking about. Lastly, you can't criticize Orwell. I think that that's not structurally true because the more impact that a piece of future literature has arises from the fact that it resonates with people and that when they look for it in their own life, when they relate to it, they find something because that is what makes them talk about it. So maybe the factual criticism is lesser, but there's a natural selection process that if it is not reflective or if it is not relevant, it simply fades out of common parlance because it is not something that matters to people. People reinterpret and use it as a tool to conceptualize things that are abstract and difficult. That is something that still actualizes the criticism that Hadar wants. Last piece of rebuttal, you're not worried about dystopia. I think ultimately, you observe specific things about the world that would come to be worse. I think that is specifically something that is often covered in dystopia in terms of how you got there and how, salami tactics, like straw that broke the camel's back type things are incredibly common topics in them because they are interesting and compelling. On reconstruction, what do we get in terms of response? A, white writers are symmetrical. I think possibly that might be true, but Gwen's case specifically applies to readers because at the point where you have people who are trying to appease their conceptualization of the past and get rid of historical guilt, I think you are specifically likely to have them engaging with that. Oh, there's PC criticism. That doesn't affect white middle class readers who are just trying to have a fun time with a book. Like reality check, they don't care if someone on Huffington Post says a book is racist. Thirdly, with regard to the notion that Orwell is also bad, I think this ultimately relatively symmetrical because you can have bad interpretations for all kinds of things. I think Gwen gives you the likelihood analysis for how future pieces are likely to systematically generate a variety of information that simply cannot be accessed in past pieces, while also being able to incorporate the valuable things from past stories. Lastly, climate change is not in history. Climate change generates massive amount of injustice. It is also to a degree in history, like I think, but also it is like just simply the motion is about injustice generally. It is what is focused on in terms of our discussions of injustice. It is the largest challenge, one of the largest challenges that we have to talk about, and it affects all the other injustices we're talking about. You cannot assess racism without considering the ways in which technology and climate change challenges affect the fact that we have different material conditions for how to interpret it. Before moving into dealing with opening opposition, I'll take your points of information.
Has some impact on behavior, but is secondary to the dozens PM names at the top of their speech. We told you there is intrinsic value in majority individuals being able to better understand the plight of oppressed communities and telling the real stories of real people and people feeling their history and pain is validated.
So I think this is interesting. I think I'm going to quickly do one remaining point of rebuttal to CO because the rest of it is my rebuttal to OL. With regard to art being considered propaganda, like at the point where you start reading an art piece, maybe, but you change your mind, right? At the point where you started reading it afterwards and you're made to relate to it, then it changes the things that you do and all the mechanisms Gwen talks about that are responded to. Let's talk about opening opposition. This is like the future is white. Maybe I think there's incentives to like appeal to more demographics and therefore you're likely to include people of color in it. Secondly, escapism. I think you change your mind when you read it, already analyzed. With regard to stuff from the past, in terms of this being by members or successors of the community, I don't think those are the most read pieces, but also even if I think there's access distortions with regard to who can write, i.e. white and privileged people have more free time, more clout, more connections to publishers. I think they are ultimately still going to be likely. In terms of giving voice, I think this is structurally selective and distortion because you can't give voice to everyone. There's also more pain when you feel like something that is your own experience is portrayed badly and wrongly. You don't read this to learn, but also with regard to weighing. People who read to learn are probably fine on either side. They read a paper on opening opposition. People who read for fun are given better concepts on our side. They're the group where a difference is made in terms of what you learn. For all of those reasons, closing government. It's been an absolutely wonderful experience speaking with Gwen and at this competition. I am so happy. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their final speech and we'll go bench for their remarkably wholesome contributions and invite the op whip to conclude the case for side op and the debate as a whole.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yep.
I'll take POIs in the chat, please, and can you please put your team code next to it? And before I start, I wanted to say thanks to Hadar for speaking with me. The reason I asked her to speak with me is just so I can improve as a speaker, and I think I've learned a lot from Hadar, so I just want to say thank you for this experience. And thanks to everyone for a great tournament. Woo. Okay, timer. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to make one general observation about the debate panel and specifically why CO win this debate. I think all other teams in this debate are affected by specifically the privilege that happens within art and the specific expressions of art that occur. Insofar as I don't think CO relies on this, and even if privilege is specifically something that means that certain art is prioritized over other, we can still show how there is still a level of education that people get specifically, which allows them to be reflexive over their own behaviors and actions, which is better on our side. I think CG is affected by this less than other teams, which is why I think I'm going to weigh over front half first and then go on to CG and show you why both top half teams are out of the debate. I think the main premise as to why specifically top half is out of this debate is because they rely on the creator themselves specifically producing the change that is necessary. And I think this is specifically where both of them fall in. First of all, doing some bench weightings against opening opposition. I think that they're mainly reliant on the creator, right? They never specifically prove that the agency of the people who read these books will A, actually do read them, and B, are so the ability for people to see this in the first place and then allow them to then be able to engage in that in such a way that they specifically change the behaviors that they do, right? Because insofar as they never impact their case by saying what happens with these alternative perspectives other than them just existing, they are reliant on people then reading it specifically, right? Because they say a couple of things. They say that dystopias are unfamiliar for the reader, specifically like that, and then they say, but you can have well-researched things which have historical backings, which means you're less likely to dismiss them, and you can have alternative perspectives of trauma and things like that. I think insofar as people read a wide variety of materials and things like that, I'm unsure the margin of change specifically on opening position, i.e. the ability for people to read these alternative perspectives and why people will be incentivized to read these perspectives in general. They just show that specifically artists will specifically want to create this art, but I'm unsure the level of change that it will get and why specifically people will be able to do this. I think opening government, therefore, specifically have more problems with this concept in general, because OG's metric is specifically justice and the arc of justice pointing the direction of helping people who specifically want to recreate their narrative. I think that there are a couple of things which are in opening government's case, especially framing, which is already self-defeating for them. I think that first of all, insofar as you have less control over the narrative, why is that likely to be the case? Because insofar as they never prove why people without privilege are the ones that will be able to recreate their narrative, i.e. they've been going on specifically about people who will be able to recreate the narrative, but I'm unsure why, like running in parallel to opening government, why specifically people who do have privilege have the ability specifically to create narratives that run counter to this and be able to rework themselves, i.e. because there's a level of uncertainty and you never specifically know what the future will hold, people will never be able to opt in and believe that the narrative that you're reworking and recreating will specifically be the right one, which means you do not have agency or control over it because you are also affected by artistic privilege, right? Which means specifically when you don't know the future, you cannot have any accountability over that art and any regulation, which means you don't know if it's a correct reworking of the art, which means no one's legitimizes this art in the first place, which means you never get the arc of justice that opening government talks about because no one cares about it, because no one can legitimize or show that it's specifically something that happens. And it's surprised they never prove when people reflexively change their opinion specifically towards this, they don't get any impact, right? Because they don't show that the right people specifically will be able to rework the narrative, because a high artistic capital is required for you to specifically show something that's futuristic. And insofar as people who have privilege are the only ones that are able to do this, I'm unsure that they can guarantee diversity specifically. And I don't think they're able to, when it's all hypothetical, I don't think they're able specifically to do that, right? Which means that in the unknown, the fear of the unknown and all this sort of stuff can be weaponized by people who have privilege even more, because privileged people can just assert that this is specifically the futuristic art that they do and just wash out the people who are like specifically poor, which is why this is all symmetrical analysis, because all of the privilege that and all of the hierarchy that exists within art will still stay, because insofar as you can just rework the narrative if you want to, but I'm unsure specifically why the creator is the most specific person in this narrative that specifically should be helped the most, right? Because the purpose of art is a couple of things. First of all, like Hadar said, to convey artistic emotion, to feel something proximate to you, to relate to art, and it allows you specifically to refute and be and not abuse art, but specifically show the interpretation that you want to be able to understand what the view is, right? Insofar as then it is all about the consumer, I'm unsure why the creator is most important and why they should specifically be able to recreate the narrative to begin with, right? Which means I think top half is out of this debate. Going on to CG, because I think they specifically have a more important case. I think there are a couple of things to say. I think largely all of Kat's responses to Hadar were quite just reductive specifically, because I don't think we just focus on this like literature lesson to begin with, right? Because I think what Hadar shows you is that we don't rely on privilege or different people producing this art, right? Because insofar as the majority of people in our world will be producing art like art about the past specifically, you'll be able to be exposed to this. And insofar as there are in like status quo mechanisms specifically which force you to specifically to engage in a discourse like Hadar says, for example, like the news, history lessons or things like that, people are specifically biologically wired and internally wired specifically to challenge things, for them to be inquisitive and have doubt over things, which means that they're specifically more likely to opt into things like facts and logic and more likely to be inquisitive, right? Because they're forced to, i.e. like, you know, getting homework after a history lesson, being forced to do all these things. Even if you don't like the literature in art in your lessons, like Kat says, you are still forced specifically to learn more about it, because you specifically have a subjective nature of art that you want to specifically find more about it, because people don't like being in an asymmetry of information specifically, which means you, on their side, you internally know that it's a dystopia, but you will never be able to understand how specifically to be able to deal with that, because you don't know it's true and you don't have certainty over that, which means you don't know specifically what you should do specifically to understand that, which is why those missing links in CG, they never proved why there'll be effective political actors, which is the burden that they set themselves. Before 6, opening government.
We told you that the moral guilt is lacking, so you can be open as opposed to defensive. Instead, you're scared as opposed to thinking something's over, and you relate to the impacts versus minimizing it, regardless of who makes it.
15 seconds. Okay, I think I want a couple of responses to this. First of all, I think that I don't understand why you specifically as a creator will specifically be able to have the right conception of this, like reworking of this, right? Insofar as you still may have moral guilt because you are unsure specifically if the dystopia you're creating is specifically the right one, and you're uncertain specifically of what is specifically happening in the future. You as the creator don't know specifically if you are creating the right thing, because you as the artist have a certain level of privilege over other people, which means there's a vicious cycle, and it's your argument is circular because you're just perpetuating privilege by specifically not knowing that you are creating the right thing for people, right? Okay, I think there are a couple of other things to say insofar as going back onto CG. I think insofar as you will never know, and they never prove why you'll be an effective political actor because you will never control this change, you specifically don't know if this is the right conception of things, which means that if you have to default specifically to the research that you do because it's based on facts and logic, because you understand that art is subjective, which means we are the only people in this debate proving why you are not affected by privilege, but you are in every scenario you're forced to look at facts and logic because that's how people are biologically wired, and for these reasons proud to oppose.
Cool. We thank the speaker for their fine speech, and once again, thank you all for listening. A really fun, really enjoyable debate to watch and listen to. And once again, congratulations for all of you to make it for making it here. I managed it.